People are joining.
Welcome, everybody. We're letting people in. I'm going to give a second for everyone to join. We're letting people in off of the waiting room. Thanks for joining. And we're recording too, so we'll get going here. Thanks for joining IEC for our Lunch and Learn series today. We're hoping these sessions are keeping our community connected during this difficult time. And of course, we're making them publicly available and they're free to join. So please do keep encouraging your networks and your friends and family to join us here. We're here for at least another couple weeks, it looks like. I'm Jeff Sheldon. I'm the Development Director at the Illinois Environmental Council. And for those that aren't familiar with IEC, we were founded in 1975 by a group of dedicated grassroots environmentalists. Since that time, IEC has led issue advocacy campaigns by allowing environmental organizations to pool their resources and create a higher profile for environmental issues. So today we represent more than 90 environmental and community organizations and nearly 400 individual members from throughout Illinois. If you're not already a member of IEC and are eligible to give, please consider joining us today. You can do so by visiting illenviro.org/donate, and Ayana will be posting that link in the chat box. So a few housekeeping tips before we get going with today's presentation. All attendees are muted by default. If you joined via Zoom, please use the chat function to ask questions, add comments, and provide resources. Definitely encourage you to do that throughout the presentation today, and we'll pause a couple of times to get your feedback. And then time permitting, and we expect this to happen, we'll do some questions at the end. And again, you can use the chat box, or we'll give you directions to take yourself off mute. I just want to do a quick exercise to get your fingers warmed up and into the chat and ask everyone how they're doing on a scale of 0 to 1. So if you're feeling perfect, you're a 1. If you're feeling even good, you're at a 1. And I'm hoping to see a bunch of 1s put in that chat box here pretty quickly. I'm a 1, by the way. But with that, all right, we're seeing some 0.75 and some 1s. That's great. We'll get going. I'm really pleased to introduce an individual from one of IEC's affiliate members. Today we're welcoming Marcella Bondie Keenan. She's the Program Director of Climate Planning and Programs at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, or CNT. And Marcella, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Great, thanks. I'm going to share my screen now, and I'm going to take myself off video. So give me one moment. So today I'm going to be talking about disparities in urban flooding for communities of color. As Jeff mentioned, I'm with CNT, the Center for Neighborhood Technology. We're a 40-year-old nonprofit based in Chicago, although we do work nationally. We work on the built environment, particularly climate, transportation, data analytics, housing, with the goal of doing research and programs that are providing solutions for communities, particularly communities that have been disadvantaged. I just want to check, I'm getting some pop-ups on my screen, I think because I'm the host. Can you see those as well or no? How can I get rid of those for you?
The pop-ups are, we're letting folks into the waiting room. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
In from the waiting room? Yeah, we're not seeing them on your screen, and
Okay.
Ayana and I are letting people in, so you
Gotcha.
should be good to go.
I will just ignore them then. All right, so in 2014, CNT released a study called The Prevalence and Cost of Urban Flooding. And just to give you a little breakdown of where I will be discussing, first I'll start with some background on urban flooding in general, then I will talk about the update to our study that we published last year. I will then move into some of the technical solutions for urban flooding, and then we'll open it up for a policy discussion that I hope you'll participate in. So in 2014, CNT released a study called The Prevalence and Cost of Urban Flooding, and it was a case study of Cook County in Illinois. So previous to this, the established methodology is to simply model riverine and coastal impacts. So in other words, if there's more rain, what will happen to the river or the coast in that case? And those result in FEMA's flood insurance rate maps, or FIRMs. So that is the established way of deciding whether or not an area is at risk of flooding. But we had been hearing for several years that people in Chicago were flooding chronically and sometimes quite severely, and they were not in a floodplain. Most of Chicago is not. So we decided to try a new methodology that was based, instead of the established modeling that FEMA did, using insurance claim data related to flood claims. We also collected qualitative data through structured interviews and community forums. What we learned from the insurance data for Cook County, which covered two of the major insurance providers, as well as the publicly available federal flood insurance data, was that the average payout per claim was over $4,000. But from the structured interviews, we learned that households were flooding repeatedly. So if you can imagine you're flooding 5 times, your actual damages are perhaps $20,000. And they are also experiencing negative health impacts. People talked about asthma being exacerbated, other chronic cardio issues, but they also talked about a sense of shame, a sense of isolation, to the point where they wouldn't invite people to their home, and they certainly wouldn't talk about it. They thought it was just them. It felt very frustrating, it was hard to predict, and it also felt like something that was just their problem. And so all of these factors combined together was making the problem hidden and difficult for communities to organize around. Because in Chicago, most of the flooding that's chronic is in fact basement backup flooding. So in other words, the sewer backs up through the plumbing in people's basements, and raw sewage and stormwater then floods their homes. So this is kind of flooding that's not easy to see from the street. So the even more important finding from this is that the flooding occurred not only repeatedly, but extensively across outside of FEMA designated floodplains. As I mentioned, Chicago has very few floodplains. Most zip codes don't have any, and yet we were seeing flood claims across all of the zip codes. So all that to say that the FEMA FIR maps are not the end of the story when it comes to deciding whether or not a home is at risk of flooding. So because of this, the state passed the Urban Flooding Awareness Act, and IDNR was tasked with doing a study that was published in 2015. They used the same methodology as C&T's reports, but with an expanded data set with more insurance data and at a more refined scale. They found very similar things. First of all, nearly all counties reported flooding, and the cost of these flood claim payouts was over $2 billion. And the percent of claims outside of the floodplain was over 92%. So very similar to what we saw in Cook County. So clearly this isn't just a Chicago issue. People all across the state are flooding whether or not they're in a FEMA designated floodplain. Then we also found that low and moderate income families were more impacted by flooding. So in 2014 in Cook County, we saw that the lower income zip codes were disproportionately impacted. And the state study showed the same thing. This chart shows the percent of household flooding claims by the average annual household income, and more than half of these claims were made in households that earned less than $55,000 per year. So in 2018, C&T undertook an update to our study where we used an expanded insurance data set and for more types of data and for more years to look more specifically at the demographics of who's flooding in Chicago. You can see the full report at these links here, and there's also an interactive map where you can enter an address or a zip code and get more specific information about the flooding situation there. So the upshot of this report is that in Chicago, communities of color are more impacted by flooding. Again, flood claim payouts were made in 56 of our 59 zip codes, and nearly everywhere in Chicago. Between 2007 and 2016, totaled over 200,000 claims with over $400 million in insurance payouts. But the major takeaway is that 87% of flood damage insurance claims were paid in communities of color. So I'm just going to repeat that. In Chicago, 87% of flood damage insurance claims were paid in communities of color. Okay, so let's look at the distribution of the number of insurance claims in Chicago. It's severely skewed. So on this chart at the bottom, you see the number of claims in thousands, and on the side, you see the number of zip codes. So 26 zip codes had less than 1,000 flood claims over this time period. That's almost half. And then more than half had less than 2,000 claims. But then you have all of these claims before that, up to one zip code at the very end that had more than 21,000 flood insurance claims in this time period. So you can see this is not an even distribution. If it were, you would see this as sort of a fairly even set of bars across the chart. Okay, now let's look at the distribution of households of color in Chicago. Chicago is extremely segregated, which if you're familiar with the city, you would know. The chart at the bottom shows that there's a split between percent households of color. So you can see that there's a block of zip codes that are more than 70% households of color. And then there's another split on the other side with fewer than 60%. If this were a more integrated community, you would see more of a bell curve. There's a history to this, why the segregation has occurred, and I'll get into that a little bit more later. So there's a relationship between flood claims and households of color. You can see from this chart that flooding impact actually becomes larger as the percentage of household of color increase past 60%. And even past 80%, there's an even sharper inflection. To describe the methodology that we used, we ordered the zip codes by the numbers of claims from high to low, so we put them in order, and then we made breaks in the data once the number of households in the zip codes equaled approximately 1/4 of Chicago's total population for households, so normalizing it on population. If you take a look at the quartiles, you can see that the flooding claims are not evenly distributed among households. The pie chart shows the average claims per 1,000 households, and you can see one slice of that pie is nearly 3/4 of all claims. So if we look at this a little more closely, quartile 1 has the most claims, quartile 4 has the least claims. Quartile 1, that really big slice of the pie, 72% of all the flood claims, versus quartile 4, which you could barely see on the chart, less than 1%. And yet the flood damage payouts are not proportional. So even though there's 72% of the flood claims here, there's only 59% of the flood claim insurance dollars went there versus 1% in quartile 4, so almost double. And so you can also see that the average payout per claim is very different. In quartile 1, it's $1,500. In quartile 4, it's $5,500. And again, the zip codes, the minimum and maximum number of claims per zip code. In quartile 1, approximately 24,000 claims in one zip code. And again, let's take a look at the households of color by percent in those zip codes. So 93% in this quartile that has the most flooding. And also the median household income is quite low, $32,000. If you compare that to quartile 4, only 30% of the households of color, and there's a much higher household income, $92,000. So I just want to point out that this quartile with the most claims, the most impact, is actually getting less money per claim, and they are also the quartile that has the least financial resources per household to actually handle responding to the flooding. So let's take a look at the map of Chicago. It shows the percent of households of color by zip code. You can see that in the shading. Clear shading is less than 1/3 households of color. The blue shading is between 1/3 and almost 2/3. And then the heaviest shading is like 60% to 100% households of color. And that's the purple shading. And then if you overlay that with the number of claims, you can see that there's definitely a trend where the south and the west sides are both predominantly households of color and also have the most flooding severity according to the insurance data. And again, let's look at the average payout per claim. We can see that the larger the purple dot, again, is the more households of color you have in roughly thirds. And then the payout per claim, the lighter yellow is the least amount of payout total. And then the darker is the higher payout. So we can see that these very high value claim payouts are happening mostly northwest and a bit on the north side too, versus these very low dollar payouts happening predominantly on the south side. And and a bit on the west side. But insurance data isn't the whole story. We also have 311 data that's related to flooding. Because not everybody has flooding insurance, and even if they do, not everyone is equipped to sort of navigate the bureaucracy that is required to get your money. Because again, this is only data from claims that were actually paid, not all claims that were filed. And again, you can see that the 311 calls and claims track kind of along those earlier maps, showing that on the south and the west sides, you have more 311 calls. We also know that these are the areas that are predominantly people of color. And I don't want to forget sort of the personal impact of this. So I showed you a bunch of maps and charts, but this is what it actually looks like in practice in a basement, sometimes even in moderate rain, depending on the condition of the sewer infrastructure that is serving this household. It might also look like this. This is from the southeast side in the 10th ward. This photo was provided through work that we did with Olga Bautista, who's with the Southeast Environmental Task Force and Alliance for the Great Lakes. Last spring, residents in this ward were severely flooded during the spring rains that hit a lot of the Midwest. And this is the view of the train tracks that border a residential area. On the other side of this picture is somebody's backyard. In this case, the flooding was so intense that the railroad company had to move the barricades that would normally separate the home from the tracks in order to keep the tracks from being submerged. And all of that water then flooded into the neighborhood area. The other layer of this is that on the southeast side, they have a number of industrial properties, some Superfund sites, and a lot of historical pollution as well that remains there. So when you have this kind of overland flow, there's concerns not just about your typical pollutant runoffs and sewage, but also toxics that are in the environment and being uncontrolled then. If you're more interested in this, I encourage you to check out the blog post that I linked to earlier. So now, what does this mean in terms of COVID-19 and coronavirus? What does it mean to shelter in place when your home is flooded? This is a map from NOAA that shows the spring 2020 US precipitation outlook. You can see that Illinois is solidly in the prediction for a very wet spring. There's a separate flooding map that also shows that there's moderate to severe flooding predicted for parts of Illinois as well. But what does this mean when you actually can't stay in your home because of flooding? What if you have to go to a shelter that might be crowded and you can't do social distancing? Or what if you're able to stay in your home, but your home is damp and chronically damp because of basement backups, so that you already have these underlying respiratory risk factors? There's one study from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory that says that about 1/5 of all asthma cases are related to building dampness, which is a very common effect of chronic flooding. So I just want to throw that out there for conversation as well. So before I get into the section about why it's happening, I'd like to open it up to any questions that you might have about the reports themselves that we can answer. And Jeff, I'll leave it to you to facilitate those. Feel free to enter them into chat.
Yeah, so we welcome the questions in the chat box, or if you would like to do it audibly, you can raise your hand by hitting *6, and I can help you unmute yourself, or you can dial *9 if you're on your phone, or you can take yourself off mute in the Zoom app itself. So there's a question about whether we're going to share the PowerPoint, and we will do that. Thank you, Dean. And while people are adding some questions, I definitely have a couple, so maybe I'll go first. I'm curious how the flooding results compare to other regions in the country. You know, is Illinois and Chicago different than other major metropolitan or even at the statewide level?
Well, there's definitely other urbanized areas in Illinois that experience this urban flooding impact. I think Peoria is a great example. I believe that there might be a webinar coming up about that. Great example, of course, in the sense that they also experience a lot of urban flooding. This methodology hasn't been done everywhere. So if you look at the IDNR report, it does show some of the other cities that are more impacted, it's also not distinct to Illinois. So as part of our work back in 2012, we surveyed a number of the Great Lakes cities and found that it was a pretty pervasive problem. They didn't have a word for it though. There was no such term as urban flooding before we started to discuss it in 2014. They just knew that their drainage systems were inadequate for their communities and people were getting flooded that was unrelated to the floodplain. But again, this wasn't an issue that was even had terminology or common standards around it, but it's certainly one that affects a lot of legacy cities with older infrastructure and even some without, with more recent infrastructure.
Thanks. Okay, so we have a couple from the audience. First from Colleen, asking whether you can explain more about flood insurance, why it is seemingly broken, and what we can do about it.
That is a little outside of my scope of PowerPoint today, and I'm also not the biggest expert. I think there's some other IEC members that would be better equipped to talk about flood insurance.
Okay, yeah, we can definitely round up some answers and share them afterwards. Joyce is asking if there's offices for individuals with flooding to get help and how accessible the paperwork is for filing assistance. I don't know if that's up your
yeah, I mean, I am going to talk a little bit about some of the solutions that are out there, but typically flooding, what we've seen is that it depends, first of all, on there being a disaster being declared, so that there can be appropriation to support a specific response, but then you have to prove that you were part of a specific flooding disaster. So that's one resident assistance program. Otherwise, you're kind of stuck with your typical sort of either home insurance, and you have to make sure you have the right kind of insurance rider, or anyone can really buy NFIP, and you can try to go through that process. But it's really a community by community question, and different communities have taken different approaches to it depending on their capacity and the severity of their issue.
Great. The next question is whether there are maps that include CISA or other Western suburbs, and I would say just more broadly than the Chicago map you're presenting.
Yeah, so in the 2014 report, that Cook County map covers all of Cook County. And that's still on the C&T website. You can get a PDF there. You can also check out the IDNR report if you're looking at Illinois. I believe there's at least one map in that report. Yeah.
Okay, great. We've got a couple more. So Carson is wondering if there's been any positive impacts in flood-prone communities because of newly online flood mitigation infrastructure like TARP.
I think that's a complicated question. I think the thing to remember about TARP is that the water has to get to the TARP. So those interceptors, and I think Dean is probably from MWRD. So Dean, feel free to respond in chat as well. Any thoughts about this? But basically, homes are connected to the sewer system through a series of smaller pipes that eventually end up into the TARP system. So if there's a bottleneck in those smaller pipes getting to TARP, that particular home or block of homes is not going to be helped.
Yeah, and Svetlana has a related question about whether TARP has helped. You may have just addressed that, but I know with the McCook Reservoir opening, that reduced a lot of the impact. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
No, I don't have any comments on that.
Okay. Yeah, great. We're throwing some hard ones at you here. Thanks for being game. Let's see if we can do a couple more. Let's see. So I guess there's a sort of a counter question about whether there's any credibility that wealthy households or otherwise don't file flood claims because of the saleability of their homes.
That's definitely something I've heard. I haven't actually seen any research to substantiate or say one way or the other whether or not that's happening.
Okay, great. I know we have a couple more, but maybe we'll save those for the end. Do you think we should get back to the next section, or do you want to keep going?
Sure, we can continue to collect and get back to that. All right, so why is it happening? I'm sure that many of you on the call know a lot of these reasons. So first of all, of course, there's climate change. So in the past 50 years, we've had a marked and observed change in heavy precipitation, the kind of events that overwhelm a drainage system very quickly. These maps show that in the Great Lakes region, it's more than 42% of the very heaviest kind of storms. Then, of course, we have increased urbanization. So whereas in a natural ground cover situation, like our original prairie state conditions, we'd only have 10% runoff that could become a flooding condition. And in urban environments like this, like the bottom right folder of photo, you have 55% runoff. So all that water has to go somewhere, and sometimes it goes into people's homes. There's also aging infrastructure, of course. So in older cities, this infrastructure may have been designed and built originally 100 years ago. And so it was built at a smaller size, not necessarily accounting for the kind of storms we're seeing today, and not accounting for the amount of runoff that we're getting from highly impervious surfaces. And then, of course, there's issues of maintenance. So particularly in communities with constrained resources, and truthfully, that's all communities, we all make choices about what to maintain and invest in. You could end up with sewer pipes that look something like this. So a small pipe is made even smaller by a lot of buildup inside the pipe itself. And then there's just the question of where in the community the investments happen first, sort of like who gets priority in that community. The AACE has an annual report card on infrastructure for all the states, and the last time I checked, Illinois was at a C- for water infrastructure. And then, of course, there's historical policies and practices. So I wanted to bring back this slide from earlier. I mentioned that Chicago is highly segregated. This was due to the federal policy of redlining. The map on the right shows how communities were graded in terms of investment risk. So various neighborhoods were graded according to factors, including the racial composition of that neighborhood. So communities with a lot of people of color and a lot of immigrants were graded as a higher investment risk. I'm sorry if I said insurance, investment risk. And were the people in those neighborhoods were not able to access lending credit. This matters because it directly affects the property values and the general community vitality of those neighborhoods. There's some very good studies that show that this was happening nationwide, and that property, those sort of legacy community disinvestment impacts have happened nationally and over a series over a period of decades. So these things that, these policies that came to place and were not actually challenged until I think the 70s, are still continuing to have an impact in terms of the built environment that we see today. So this kind of segregation and these kinds of federally allowed and supported policies create the conditions for the environmental injustice that we see when we take a look at where urban flooding is happening within our communities. So this chart that shows that, 93% of the hardest hit zip codes the quartile of the zip codes that are 93% communities of color are hardest hit. There is definitely a historical link there that we need to acknowledge and think about when we're assessing our own programs and thinking about which data to analyze and at what scale, because if you are able to look at a fine enough scale, you're able to see disparate impacts between groups. A lot of times people, I give this talk and people will say, we don't have these communities we don't have these people in my communities. We don't have EJ groups in my city according to the data that we've looked at. I think oftentimes they're thinking about a particular people group and maybe not thinking about the diversity of their community as a whole. And they're also maybe not looking at a fine enough scale. So any community that has segregation, either because they were officially redlined or because they had racial covenants, if you don't know what that is, I highly recommend the book called The Color of Law, or simply because they had segregation that was enforced in more informal ways, has the potential to have these kinds of disparate impacts in urban flooding and a variety of other environmental impacts that directly affect people's health, their property value, their ability to thrive and have opportunity. So I would like to offer this to the group as a fourth option that is less talked about in terms of why urban flooding occurs and where it occurs. So with that little bit, before I get into the technical solutions, are there any questions relevant to this section around the practices and policies that affect urban flooding?
So I think we had one from about whether the recent watershed management ordinance would impact the statistics or the study. I don't know if you've addressed that already, but maybe you could touch on that.
Yeah, the MWRD's WMO actually doesn't affect the city of Chicago. So if we're talking about the Chicago area only, then the answer is no. And, you know, WMO generally requires, as I understand it, more infiltration on new developments above a certain size. So it wouldn't really affect so much existing residential properties and individual flooding cases, or even just residential developments that are smaller than the threshold. But it's always great to encourage infiltration community-wide. That in itself will, of course, reduce the burden on the sewer infrastructure generally. I will just point out that sewer infrastructure also happens in catchments. So in other words, you could call them sewer sheds. So a neighborhood is a somewhat discrete unit in terms of how water flows in and out and through the sewer system. So infiltration in one area of a community, which maybe has a lot of development, it's a really hot area, is not necessarily going to have a really big impact on a sewer shed that is disconnected from it hydrologically and doesn't have that same level of development spurring new infiltration practices. Okay, so I'm going to get into some of the technical talk a little bit, just briefly, because I think many of you are pretty expert in this area. So at CT, we think about a hierarchy for flooding mitigation. Obviously, if you can avoid stormwater runoff by protecting open space, that's your top value, but in urban setting, that's often not possible. So we try to sink it by adding porous pavements, trees, rain gardens in areas that are more densely populated. We also can try to hold it temporarily in detention basins that may serve a double purpose. So for example, a stormwater park, a golf course that can serve as detention, that sort of thing. And then finally, we can use our traditional model of sending it to wastewater treatment facilities and stormwater facilities using pipes and tunnels and ditches. So for green stormwater infrastructure, the best practices on public and private property look like some of these. Again, there's bioswales, there's rain gardens, permeable pavements, and then on private property, you have things like rain gardens in your yard, dry wells, cisterns, even permeable driveways. It might look something like this. Mayor Daley called this the greenest street in America, at least of 2012. Cermak Avenue in the Pilsen neighborhood in Chicago. One moment, please. Okay, I'm back. Sorry for the interruption. There was a little background noise. So in Pilsen neighborhood, so this was a street improvement project that involved, among other things, a bioswale and a planter box along the side of the road. Also permeable pavement that was high albedo, meaning it reflected light so that it was less prone to urban heat island. And then we also made it a complete street through adding bike lanes and we also had some climate mitigation benefits through a low light, sorry, this isn't actually on there, but concrete that was catalytic, so it was eating smog. So this is a way that you can layer green infrastructure that has many benefits into one project. And this is always a good strategy because streets and transportation tend to get a lot more funding than just sort of standalone green infrastructure projects. Then we have this high performance rain garden in a neighborhood looks like it's part of an urban downtown, which is, serves as a pocket park and also a sort of a habitat area. So it might look like this. Or here's a series of residential strategies. You can see a rain garden in the front yard. You can see a large cistern connected to a disconnected downspout on the side. And then you can see a permeable driveway. So at C&T, based on some of the feedback that we got through our 2014 study from residents, we piloted a solution called Rain Ready to address some of the issues, things like we don't know what the problem is, we don't know what contractor to trust, we don't know which solutions to pick. So Rain Ready is meant to be a comprehensive wraparound program to help residents work through their issues with flooding. We've been doing it in the Village of Oak Park since 2017. We've had a relatively modest amount of installations, just yard installations of rain gardens and dry wells and deep pavings, but we estimate that we are diverting almost 750,000 gallons of rain annually from the Oak Park sewer system through this process. But parcel by parcel probably isn't going to get us to these bigger stormwater and flooding issues that communities often face. So then we need to think about district stormwater, which is using an engineered network of green infrastructure projects across a neighborhood to provide stormwater utility services. So a thoughtful and coordinated series of installations of green stormwater infrastructure that is meant to relieve pressure on the sewer system, and in fact complement it in a way that's flexible and can be added to without significant additional cost or disruption. So you don't necessarily need to tear up the street, for example, to install a new piece of your district stormwater project. And of course, there's quite a few benefits to doing this beyond just stormwater. So whereas a sewer pipe has one very important function, green infrastructure can also layer on additional functions. So this chart is from a 2011 report called The Value of Green Infrastructure, and it shows the variety of benefits that green infrastructure might provide. So it can include improving air quality. A green roof, for example, can reduce a building's energy use. Plants, of course, absorb atmospheric carbon, so you're mitigating climate change. And then, it can even reduce noise pollution, things like that. But even more importantly, it can be linked to community priorities for the residents there. So maybe residents are not so concerned about having climate change be mitigated, but maybe they are very concerned with the air quality in their neighborhood and jobs opportunities. A thoughtfully designed comprehensive green infrastructure program that puts residents' priorities first can deliver these things depending on sort of the willingness and the creativity of the program designer. So I encourage you to check out this recent publication, the Green Value Strategy Guide, that links various community priorities with green infrastructure strategies. Of course, all of this has to be paid for. This is just a short list of options. There's the legally required routes, like the EPA consent decree related to combined sewer overflows. There's grants, again, often at the federal level. There's loans at the state level. There's bonds, which might be at the state or regional or local level. Then you have local government options, like just general taxes, the overall water utility, or perhaps a dedicated stormwater utility, several of which exist in Illinois. And then you have you have program add-ons, like, for example, the HUD Community Development Block Grants, if you are linking it to job creation. And so that's the end of the technical portion. Before we get into the policy discussion, are there any questions in that regard?
Yeah, so we had a question, which I think you partially addressed in the later slide, about why there aren't more green streets like the one on Cermak. Is it lack of funding? Is it too expensive? Is there a lack of cooperation between agencies? Or the other prompts for you on this one?
Yeah, no, I think those are all factors depending on the specific situation. Absolutely, there's a lack of funding for dedicated green infrastructure, and that's where layering it in as an incremental part of a project becomes really important. It's really hard to go after funding just for green infrastructure. But if you can say this is part of a larger program, it really opens up opportunities. Cooperation between agencies is critical. So, for example, that project was a transportation project, so it came out of the Department of Transportation, but maintaining that bioswale isn't necessarily an assigned duty for either the Department of Transportation or the Department of Water Management. That assignment has to be allocated to someone, and they have to commit to doing that over time. And then, of course, maintenance is a crucial part of the puzzle. So you can't install permeable pavement in an area if you aren't willing to periodically have a vacuum truck come and clear out and maintain it as it's needed. So those are all some driving factors for why these projects don't happen more often.
That makes sense. I was curious to know more about the Oak Park partnership and sort of who's funding that and what CNT's actual role is in all those opportunities that you're putting out there.
So it's called Rain Ready Oak Park. It is funded by the overall water utility budget through the Public Works Department. And they don't have a dedicated stormwater utility, but they do put a portion of their budget annually into these kinds of resident assistance programs. And it's a cost share grant between the municipality and the resident who applies. CNT is the administrator of the program, so we design the program, we do outreach, we enroll people, we prioritize applications as needed, and then we also offer the comprehensive home assessment. So we look, of course, at the landscape factors and provide them with a landscape design that will help them, but we also help them to look at the other issues that may be happening in their building. So maybe they have a foundation that's in need of repair, or their roof gutter and downspout system is having some issues. Our home assessor is able to help them diagnose those issues as well, so they can have a more comprehensive and realistic look at what's happening at water around their property. And then the homeowner is the one that hires a contractor and oversees the work, and then the village pays out a portion of that, up to 50% of the work afterwards. And then we monitor and ask them, about their experience, and subsequently, how does it perform in rains? So that's Oak Park. We also previously worked with the city of Chicago, a program that was time limited. It was tied to our 2013 flooding disaster. Those were one-time grants to income qualified residents. That is sort of a similar, like, holistic, home assessment process, but in those cases, the homeowner received all assessment and construction services without any cost to themselves. They just, signed a grant agreement. So that's another option for doing that as well. We're in the process of piloting a program that's sort of in between the Oak Park and the previous City of Chicago program in an area on Chicago's south side. Hopefully starting, very soon, that'll be available. So those are some of the ways that CNTs handle it. And of course, there's other municipalities taking other tacks as well. Okay,
that's great. Yeah, and that makes sense. I was hoping you could address the dynamics between Oak Park and a community like the Chicago South Side. So thank you for doing that too. Kim in the chat box is asking if you're able to share data from the Oak Park project to help convince Public Works staff to better understand the benefits of doing this kind of thing. So I don't know if there's a report you can direct her to, if we can share something afterwards.
Well, we created an evaluation report for the Village of Oak Park every year, and that goes to their city council and their staff. So if the village is open to sharing that, it belongs to them. That data is theirs.
Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat box, but encourage folks to keep plugging things in there. And do you want to get back to the PowerPoint?
Yeah, so this is a section that I am hoping folks will be very involved in and sort of offering your thoughts. And so I'd like to start a policy discussion around an equity response to urban flooding. And we have limited time today, but CNT is planning to co-host an event later this year, an in-person event, to further discuss some of these options. So consider this a teaser. So the US EPA defines environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So we can see from the data that low-income and communities of color in Chicago are disproportionately impacted by urban flooding. Again, I'll say that I think the potential for this is there in any community that has areas that are lower income or more highly populated by people of color, other things like that. So consider, this is about Chicago, but really this could relate to your community wherever you are. But all this to say, policy development should be led by the frontline communities which are most impacted by environmental justice. So that being said, I would love to brainstorm about some ways that government agencies can partner with communities to reduce flooding impacts. And I'll offer a series of slides in different areas. So first, a general equity policy. Urban flooding is not typically considered or evaluated as a potential environmental justice concern in municipal or state policies. I think in part, again, because the data is somewhat hidden, you can't just refer to a FEMA firm, at least not yet. These agencies could conduct an equity impact analysis when funding and permitting stormwater infrastructure to address urban flooding. Governments should also develop and implement an EJ policy, establish an EJ office, and adopt an EJ ordinance to guide, the implementation of a variety of policies. EJ policy should adopt language to add urban flooding as a potential EJ concern. And state and local governments should conduct equity impact analyses to assess whether or not the funds that are being used for stormwater infrastructure are in fact being equitably distributed and the relative infrastructure state of repair between communities. And again, I would encourage these agencies to use explicitly a racial equity lens as well as other lenses such as income or disability or limited English proficiency. So these are all things that can happen. Do we have any comments or remarks on that part? No?
I don't see anything in the chat box. If you would like to chime in, you could take yourself off mute right now. If you're on the phone, you could do *9 to do that.
So I'll move on to budget policy, and we can always come back to an earlier set of ideas.
Sure.
So,
Dean did just ask one question.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt you, but he's asking about the timeline for this effort.
What effort? The ideas of equity policies?
I assume, Dean, feel free to add a little bit more there.
I mean, I guess I would say that C&T is not driving these efforts. We are hopeful that agencies will be, acting on this and in a very quick manner, since urban flooding is not a new issue, but it is an increasingly severe one.
And he's giving you a thumbs up that yes, that's the sort of thing he was looking for. So that's great.
Okay.
Delia is in the chat box, and I believe she's from Cicero, and says, Cicero is a community that's not part of an organization, but a community members concerned about equity policy. I guess, Delia, you're probably asking like how do concerned citizens drive something like this if there's not an organization directly advocating for it?
I think that's a really great question. So I think community organizing then becomes part of the equation. So you have to let your elected officials and staff know that this is an area of concern that you want addressed. And I think there's a variety of ways to go about getting people together to communicate the concerns and ask for changes. We have an outreach manager at C&T that Rebecca Rains, who I'd be happy to connect folks with as well. Okay, so budget policy. So funding for green infrastructure ideally should be integrated into other local government services. So I mentioned the street project. You can use the same strategy in a variety of ways. You could look at it from economic development, housing, as other ways to integrate green infrastructure into projects that are going forward anyway. At the same time, it's really important to recognize that green infrastructure has non-monetary and not easily quantifiable benefits when you're looking at budget analyses. So these benefits might be a public good rather than a private good. And public goods are often funded through general property or sales tax as opposed to more conventional sort of private development strategies. So recognizing that this is a public good, I think, can help drive some resources into green infrastructure. Some initiatives should be elevated to capital items. They're often, these kind of requests are often added to existing operating budgets. So then it has to compete with other essential operating expenditures and doesn't acknowledge that green infrastructure is in fact long-term infrastructure. In other words, capital infrastructure that can use finance mechanisms like loans. It's not sort of a beautification project. It is in fact something complementary to your sewer pipe system. And then finally, another idea is to adopt ordinances that promote green infrastructure in all capital improvement projects. So moving on to procurement policy, we should take a look at the state and federal agencies in terms of their guidelines for grant and loan programs. So loan recipients should have to demonstrate the equitable use of funds, including funding that is prioritized for frontline communities. And also, community-based partners should be included in funding proposals and on project teams, because getting that community buy-in and that community perspective on green infrastructure is essential to acceptance and maintenance of green infrastructure in many cases. Again, governments and utilities should provide dedicated funding and programs for frontline communities that experience flooding. And they should also prioritize stormwater projects that have multiple community benefits. So going back to the idea of community priorities and how that overlays with green infrastructure, if there is, for example, a desire for job training programs, that should be integrated into the stormwater project from the beginning. A research agenda. So many of the nonprofits in Illinois have a research focus to it. And clearly, there's still a need to develop and implement a methodology for mapping urban flood risk and social vulnerability and how those things intersect. And a flood map should be updated to include an urban flooding flood zones. I know that there are some local governments that are taking steps in this area. We really need a national response to this. But there are some ways that local governments can participate in this mapping effort. For example, convening public listening sessions and community flood mapping workshops that identify the more hidden urban flooding areas. So things that aren't showing up in the 311 data, for example. Partnering with private insurers to add the private insurance claim data to local urban flood risk maps. So getting that other data set, which is actually quite hard to get. It's not available generally, but having that flood risk methodology available to local governments can really help them to see where resources are needed. Then, of course, there's things like existing stormwater flow paths and mapping those and where the key green stormwater assets are located so that they can be maintained over time. And then finally, publishing a map that incorporates flood exposure, socio-demographic, and other community health factors to show areas of a particular priority. Then we have the planning process. So stormwater planning should be done in partnership with community-based organizations. So for example, having charrettes that co-design flood mitigation projects with residents, using updated precipitation data and modeling for the future, for future climate change impacts, future land use and development impacts. Making sure that when you're engaging with residents that you're having outreach and education activities that engage the community-specific preferences and needs. Training and employing community-based organizations to provide flood prevention education for residents. So not just, oftentimes I think this becomes sort of a volunteer option for residents. It really needs to be valued as a skilled thing that should be compensated, especially for asking for people to share their personal time. Finally, developing neighborhood stormwater management plans that center community input through the planning process. So sometimes I think there's a tendency to have public meetings and town halls where we gather a bunch of information on flip charts or surveys or what have you, and that becomes part of the appendix. But at the end of the day, it's not necessarily driving the planning recommendations. And really, we need to move into a new era where we're considering that to be the core of the plan, and then we're thinking about technically and administratively, how do we make that happen? And lastly, local ordinances. So things like adopting enhanced flood protection standards for buildings and infrastructure. So land use development drives a lot of urban flooding. So we need to protect and dedicate open space and plan and enforce stormwater flow paths. We need to continue to encourage or require reduction in continuous impervious surfaces and replace that with infiltration. We need to regulate building codes to mitigate flooding. So for example, don't build within a flow path, and train building inspectors to be able to assess flood risk and identify specific actions, both within the building and in the landscaping. And another option is to require inspection of sources of inflow and infiltration to the sewers. So for example, residential connections via sump pumps or downspouts whenever property is transferred. This can often be a source of chronic flooding within the home. So those are some thoughts. I know we only have a few minutes left, so I'm happy to answer any additional questions or hear comments.
Yeah, so folks, feel free again to post anything into the chat box. Dean is letting us know that Stormwater Credit Trading Program will be a great addition in the coming months. Marcella, I had a question about your study, because I found it so enlightening when I first saw it. I think when you first published it, look, you know, it's 2018 data at least. How do we know if we're getting better at this over time? Are you all planning to refresh the data set and publish it? What are the plans along those lines?
Yeah, we don't have any, we don't have a current timeline for refreshing the data set since it just came out last year. I think that there's some movement towards increased data transparency, which would make a refresh easier and more feasible for people to do even within their own community. So I'll say TBD, hopefully data will become easier to access for everyone, and then this kind of information can be more widely distributed.
Great. I'm not seeing any last questions. Do you have any closing statement you'd like to make or anything like that?
I don't think so. I guess I'll just remind folks to keep an eye out for an in-person event later, and we would love to see your faces and you're thinking about how to address urban flooding as an environmental justice priority, what can be done in local communities.
Perfect. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining. We will continue these sessions at least for the next week or two. And we hope they're a way for you to feel connected during the pandemic. They are publicly available afterwards on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and search for Illinois Environmental Council, you'll find everything there. We're building quite the library. I hope you check it out. We will also post some of the resources that you're requesting within that YouTube share as well, so you can check that out. And I'll just remind you again that if you'd like to support IEC and the work that we're doing on issues like this, you can go to illenviro.org/donate. But again, I want to thank Marcella for presenting today and all of you for attending. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.